February 10th, 1946, Repatriation Camp, Manila. The damp chill of the pre-dawn air clung to the wool blanket. Chio held it tighter, not for herself, but for Tomiko, the younger nurse, huddled beside her. The tent flaps snapped open, letting in the smell of antiseptic soap and the sharp, clipped voice of an American officer. Attention! Red Cross inspection. A woman in a neutral uniform entered, her clipboard poised. She ignored them, instead tapping the stacked crates. Inventory: soap, 10 units, sanitary, 5 units, hosiery, 5 units. Chio's eyes fixed on the list tacked to the tent pole, a schedule of hygiene, meals, and processing. It was a ritual of order, not of malice. Tomiko flinched as the inspector's gaze passed over her. Chio placed a steadying hand on her arm. "It's all right," she whispered, the words stiff in her own throat. "Just an inspection." If these quiet moments, lost between the headlines of war, resonate with you, consider subscribing and letting us know what country you are watching from. The processing tent smelled of lye, steam, and a sharp antiseptic that reminded Chio of hospitals. But this was not a place of healing. It was a place of disassembly. "Next line! Move! Move!" The commands were in English, sharp barks that herded them like animals. Chio kept her eyes down, her body trembling under the thin, torn remnants of her uniform. This was it. The moment propaganda had warned her of. The Kaiti, the American devils, would now begin their sport. She had braced herself for brutality, for violation, for the ultimate humiliation that soldiers inflicted upon the women of a defeated nation. She had spent 2 days in the transport truck, rehearsing the ways she might die, praying only for the strength to not disgrace her family when the moment came. "Strip! Now! All of it!" A broad-shouldered American woman, a WWII Women's Army Corps with sergeant's stripes and a face devoid of all emotion, pointed at their clothes. This was the first shock. The guards were women. They were not leering, drunken men. They were cold, efficient, and seemed utterly disgusted by the state of the prisoners. Chio and the others, nurses, civilian staff, a few local collaborators, fumbled with their buttons. The air was cold, but the shame was colder. They were herded naked under harsh, steaming showers. Rough, lye soap was thrust into their hands. It stung their skin, raw from insects and filth, but Chio scrubbed with a mechanical fury. She would not give them a reason. Then they were pushed into the next tent. It was colder here, and they huddled together for warmth, their dignity stripped away, waiting. Chio's fear was a cold stone in her stomach. The same stern-faced sergeant stood by a stack of wooden crates. "Line, single file." One by one, the women shuffled forward. The sergeant, working with the impersonal rhythm of a factory machine, thrust a bundle at each woman, a small bar of soap, a thin towel. Then it was Chio's turn. The items were pressed into her numb hands. She looked down, and she stopped. There, on top of the towel, was a pair of white folded cotton underwear. Her mind ceased to function. She stared. The sergeant frowned. "Move it, sister." Chio stumbled aside, her eyes locked on the object. It was not a rough-spun rag. It was not military issue. It was soft. It was white. It was pristine, the factory crease still sharp down the middle. "Kire," she whispered, the word catching in her throat. Clean. She had not seen or felt anything truly clean in months. For the last 6 weeks of the war, she had used a strip of blood-stained parachute silk. She looked from the clean underwear in her hand to the filthy rag she had managed to hide in her fist. A wave of heat rushed to her face, so powerful it made her dizzy. It was not fear. It was shame. A profound, acidic shame that burned deeper than any physical blow could have. She had prepared for devils. She had not prepared for this. She had not prepared for a civilization so powerful, so wealthy, that it could afford to give this symbol of personal, private dignity to its most hated enemies. Chio clutched the clean underwear. It was the most shocking weapon the Americans had yet deployed. She quickly pulled them on beneath the shadow of the tent wall, the soft, clean cotton an alien sensation against her skin. It felt less like a gift and more like a verdict. The processing tent led to a long, muddy pathway flanked by rows of identical canvas tents. A guard, no older than her kid brother, pointed. Tent 7, female, in. Chio entered, her gaze sweeping the interior. It was a standard American general-purpose tent, a long canvas tunnel supported by wooden poles. 20 cots, 10 to a side, were arranged with military precision. A single, bare bulb hung from the center pole, casting a weak yellow light against the damp canvas walls. Rain drummed a constant hollow rhythm on the roof, and the air smelled of wet canvas, mildew, and the faint, unsettling sweetness of insecticide. About a dozen women were already inside. They were not talking. They sat on their cots, rigidly separate, their faces blank masks of exhaustion and suspicion. This was not a community of shared suffering. It was a collection of individuals, each isolated in her own fear. Chio chose a cot near the back, away from the entrance flap. She sat on the rough wool blanket, the canvas beneath her creaking. She placed her small bundle, the soap, the towel, beside her. Her most valuable possession, the clean cotton underwear, was already safely hidden beneath her new, oversized olive drab fatigues. It was a strange, secret armor. A whistle blew somewhere in the camp. The women flinched. The guard at the tent flap barked something about lights out and chow line. But the words were just noise. The true rules were not on the camp schedule. The true rules were in the silence between the cots. Who was a collaborator? Who was a fanatic? Who would steal your food? Chio's instinct for survival told her to remain invisible, to watch, to listen, to speak to no one. Then she heard it. It was almost imperceptible beneath the drumming rain. A small, choked sound. A sniffle, quickly suppressed. Chio scanned the cots. 3 beds down, a very young woman, barely 19, was curled on her side, her back to the tent. Her shoulders were shaking in a silent, agonizing rhythm. Chio's training warred with her fear. Do not engage. Do not show weakness. But the sight of the trembling shoulders undid her. That was not a soldier. That was not a prisoner. That was a patient. Slowly, Chio stood. The rustle of her movement caused 2 other women to look up, their eyes sharp. She ignored them. She walked the few steps and sat gently on the edge of the adjacent empty cot. The girl flinched, her breath catching in a gasp. Chio did not touch her. She spoke softly, her voice just above a whisper. I am Chio, a nurse. The girl, Tomiko, slowly turned. Her face was pale and slick with tears. They took my... She gestured vaguely, unable to name the dignity she had lost. I know, Chio said. She offered nothing but her presence. The nursing instinct, dormant for weeks, had returned. It was a purpose beyond survival. You are not alone. She did not know if it was a promise she could keep. As she sat there, a brief opening in the canvas divider at the far end of the tent, separating them from the male prisoners section, caught her eye. A man was watching. He was older, with the unmistakable bearing of an officer. His eyes were not on the guards. They were on her. They were cold, assessing, and full of judgment. The next morning offered a weak gray light that filtered through the canvas, revealing the suspended dust in the air. A schedule had been posted, written in rough English with simpler katakana translations scrawled below. 6 wo wash. Chio took her small bar of soap and her towel. She left the precious clean underwear hidden, It was too soon to risk washing it publicly. For now, she would wash herself, her fatigues, and the small towel they had issued. She needed to feel the cold water, to reinforce the reality that she was no longer caked in the filth of the battlefield. The wash station was a long metal trough with 6 spigots near the latrines. The cold ground was a mire of mud and boot prints. 2 other women were already there, scrubbing listlessly, their faces averted. Chio chose a spigot at the far end. The water was shockingly cold, smelling of iron. It numbed her hands instantly, but she welcomed the sensation. It was real. It scrubbed away the lingering nightmare. She was focused on the rhythm of scrubbing the rough fatigue fabric against a wooden board when a shadow fell over the trough. "This new life suits you, nurse." The voice was male, Japanese, and sharp with contempt. She froze. It was the officer from the night before, Mizoguchi. He stood tall, his own uniform worn but impeccably neat. He had retained his bearing even in defeat. He was not looking at her, but at the running water, as if it offended him. "You accept these comforts with ease," he continued, his voice low. Chio kept her head down, her knuckles white as she gripped the wet cloth. She said nothing. Insubordination was unthinkable, even here. They give you soap, and you scrub. They give you clean clothes, and you forget. He finally turned his gaze on her, and it was glacial. "They give you their luxuries," he sneered, "and you willingly accept this humiliation. This is not dignity. This is surrender." His words hit her like a physical blow. He was voicing the exact shame she had felt in the processing tent. But something was different now. The shame was not for accepting the soap. The shame was for the months she had lived without it. She stopped scrubbing. The only sound was the running water and the distant rhythm of the rain. She looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time. "Captain," she said, her voice quiet but not trembling. He raised an eyebrow, surprised she had spoken. "I am a nurse," she said, as if reminding herself. "There is no honor in filth. There is no spirit in disease." She gestured to the trough, to the mud. "This," she said, "is not about comfort. It is about survival. I will not let Tomiko-san die of dysentery because our spirit forbids us from using American soap." Her own words surprised her. They were simple, practical, and utterly devoid of the ideology that had governed her entire life. Mizoguchi's face tightened. He had expected a cowering woman. He found an adversary, however small. He saw her as a contamination, a weak link who had allowed the enemy's soft power to penetrate her. He looked at her hands, red and raw from the cold water, then back at her face. "You have the hands of a nurse," he said, the words a dismissal, "but you have forgotten the heart of a soldier." He turned sharply on his heel and walked away, his boots making precise, angry sounds in the mud. Chio watched him go. She was trembling now, but not from fear. It was something else. She turned back to the spigot, the water feeling even colder. She had not only washed her clothes, she had drawn a line. The clean underwear she had hidden away was no longer just a symbol of American wealth. It was a symbol of her choice. Days blurred into a routine governed by whistles and shouts. Sunday, however, felt different. The rain had eased to a persistent drizzle, but the mud was thicker, sucking at their ill-fitting boots as they were marched not to the wash station, but to a larger central tent. A bell was ringing, a strange melodic sound that Chio had not heard in years. It came from a small wooden chapel on a rise at the far end of the camp, a structure clearly intended for the American Guards. The sound was deeply unsettling. It spoke of a normality that had no place here. "What is this?" Tomiko whispered, clutching Chio's arm. "The schedule said Sunday meal," Chio replied, her voice low. She kept her eyes forward. Captain Mizoguchi and the other male prisoners were being led in a separate line, parallel to theirs. His gaze was fixed on the chapel bell, his jaw tight. Chiyo's stomach was a knot of apprehension. A special meal could mean anything. Propaganda had primed her for humiliation. She imagined watery soup served with contempt, or perhaps food deliberately tainted. She remembered the stories of prisoners in other wars being fed scraps fit only for pigs, a way to break their spirit. They filed into the mess tent. It was a vast, noisy space, filled with long wooden tables and benches. The smell was overwhelming, but not with rot. It was the smell of steam, boiled potatoes, and salt. The line moved quickly. American kitchen staff, prisoners themselves, perhaps Germans, Chiyo could not tell, slapped food onto metal trays with industrial indifference. When Chiyo reached the front, she stared at her tray. It held a large, pale scoop of mashed potatoes, cratered by a ladle of thick, brown gravy. Beside it were 3 pieces of stringy, pale meat. It was unmistakably chicken, slick with broth, likely tipped straight from a tin can. There was also a slice of white bread. She took the tray, her hands numb. She found a space at a table. Tomiko huddled beside her. Tomiko stared at the chicken. Is it safe? Chiyo picked up the small metal fork. She looked at the food. She remembered her last meal on the front line. A single cold rice ball, shared with 2 other nurses, its surface gritty with dirt. She remembered the constant, gnawing hunger that had become a permanent part of her existence, a hunger that propaganda had promised would be replaced by American brutality. The brutality, it turned out, was this: bland, hot, sufficient, and utterly impersonal. This was not an act of kindness. It was an act of logistics. It was the same organized, overwhelming power that had provided the clean underwear. It was the power of a nation that could feed its armies, its people, and its prisoners, all at the same time. Tomiko, after one more fearful glance at Chiyo, attacked the food. She ate with a desperate, shuddering hunger, her eyes closed as if afraid it would be taken away. Chiyo looked across the tent. She saw Captain Mizoguchi. He was sitting ramrod straight, his tray untouched in front of him. He was watching a guard near the door, a young American soldier who was idly chewing gum, tapping his foot to a silent rhythm. Slowly, Chiyo lifted the fork to her mouth. The potato was bland, the chicken salty and overcooked. She ate every bite. She was not just eating food, she was consuming information, and it terrified her more than any beating. The relative calm established by the Sunday meal did not last. The camp was a swamp, and the air, thick with moisture, was a perfect breeding ground for disease. By Tuesday, the coughing started. By Wednesday, it was dysentery. The air in Tent 7 turned foul. The weak light of the single bulb illuminated a scene of quiet misery. The women, already weakened by months of war and malnutrition, succumbed quickly. The latrines became a place of desperation. Then, Tomiko started to burn. At first, Chiyo thought it was the heat of the tent, but when she pressed her hand to the girl's forehead, the dry, searing heat told a different story. It was not dysentery. It was malaria. The girl was shivering, her teeth chattering, yet her skin was painfully hot. Chiyo's nursing instincts took over completely. She bullied the other women into giving up their water rations for Tomiko, using her own towel, dipped in the cold, iron-smelling water from the trough, to bathe the girl's face. She forced Tomiko to drink, spoonful by spoonful, even when the girl was delirious. She organized a rotation to empty the overflowing latrine buckets, her voice sharp and commanding. She was no longer a prisoner. She was head nurse Chiyo. The other women, even those who had eyed her with suspicion, obeyed. Her competence was a small, solid thing in the midst of their shared chaos. On the second day of Tomiko's fever, the tent flap was thrown open, not by a board guard, but by an officer in khaki. He wore the caduceus insignia, a doctor. He was a tall, tired-looking man, probably in his 40s, with deep lines around his eyes. He moved with an economy of motion, an overworked physician who had seen too much. A Japanese-American interpreter, a Nisei with a tense, unhappy face, trailed him. The doctor's eyes scanned the tent, taking in the sickness, the smell, the despair. He stopped at a few cots, checked temperatures, and scribbled on a notepad. Then he saw Chio. She was kneeling by Tomiko's cot, holding a canteen cup to the girl's cracked lips, speaking in a low, firm, reassuring tone. The doctor paused. He watched her for a full minute. He noted the way she checked the girl's pulse, the systematic way she had folded a wet cloth for her forehead, the authority with which she kept the other women at a distance. He stepped closer. Chio tensed, instinctively moving to shield Tomiko. The doctor spoke to his interpreter. The Nisei soldier translated, his voice flat. He asks, "Are you a nurse?" Chio's head snapped up. She looked at the doctor, then at the interpreter. She did not confirm or deny. She simply said, in Japanese, "She has malaria. High fever for 2 days. She needs quinine. Without it, she will die." The interpreter relayed the message. The doctor's expression did not change, but he nodded, as if she had confirmed his suspicion. He looked around the tent again, at the 4 other women who were clearly ill. He said something else. "He says," the interpreter continued, "the camp infirmary is overwhelmed. He needs help. He wants to know if you will work." Chio stared at him. Work? For them? For the enemy? Captain Mizoguchi's sneering face flashed in her mind. You accept their comforts. This is surrender. This was not comfort. This was a request. She looked down at Tomiko, who was now shivering violently, her eyes rolled back. Tomiko would not last another night in this tent. The infirmary, however overwhelmed, had medicine. It had quinine. It had sanitation. Chio's internal conflict lasted only a second, but it felt like a lifetime. She was a soldier of the emperor. She was also a nurse. The war had forced those 2 identities into a brutal collision. She stood up, her back straight, and looked the American doctor in the eye. She gave a single, sharp nod. The doctor, Major Evans, his tag read, did not wait. He barked an order, and 2 orderlies appeared with a stretcher. Tomiko was lifted, gently, but with a practiced speed that amazed Chio, and was carried out of the tent. "You," the Nisei interpreter said to Chio, "come." Chio followed them out into the rain, her boots slipping in the mud. The infirmary was not a tent. It was a long, prefabricated wooden hut set on a slightly elevated platform to keep it out of the worst of the mud. It had real windows, glass ones, that glowed with a steady, white light. The doctor pushed through the screen door, and Chio stepped inside. The difference was absolute. The air in the tent had been thick, wet, and humid. The air here was dry, warm, and smelled powerfully of carbolic acid and floor wax. It was organized. 10 beds, identical to the ones in her tent, were lined up, but here they had white sheets, tucked in with precise military corners. Tomiko was already being settled into one. "Nurse," the doctor said, pointing at Chio, then at a small sink in the corner. "Wash." The interpreter translated, but Chio had already understood. She went to the sink. There was hot water, steaming from the tap. There was a bar of yellow soap. She scrubbed her hands and forearms for a full minute, the clinical, impersonal ritual steadying her. When she turned, the doctor was holding a glass vial. "Penicillin," he said. He prepared a syringe. "You know malaria, you know dysentery. You will assist, you will keep records, You will keep this place clean." He handed her a simple paper chart. "These are the dysentery cots. These are the malaria. Do not mix them." He was not asking. He was giving orders. And for the first time in months, Chio felt a strange cold comfort. She knew how to follow medical orders. For the next hour, she worked. She was an extension of the doctor, translating his brusque efficiency into care for the Japanese patients. She took temperatures. She held down a delirious man. She cleaned a bedpan. Then the doctor pointed to a tall metal cabinet. "Supplies. Bandages. We need more." Chio opened the cabinet. She stopped, her hand frozen on the metal latch. It was not the poverty of her field hospital, where they boiled and reused the same bloody rags until they disintegrated. It was abundance. Shelves, stacked floor to ceiling. Boxes of sterile gauze, each individually wrapped. Tins of antiseptic powder, bottles of aspirin, and on the bottom shelf, dozens of small amber-colored vials, penicillin, enough to treat an entire regiment. Her mind flashed back to her field hospital near Manila, to watching a young soldier die of a simple leg wound infection, his flesh rotting while she could do nothing but offer him a wet cloth. They had one vial of penicillin. It was reserved for a general. Here it was simply supply. She reached out and touched a sealed box of cotton bandages. It was clean. It was perfectly square. It was factory made. And in that moment, the clean underwear made sense. It was not a gesture. It was not kindness. It was a byproduct. It was the casual, unthinking excess of a system so vast, so powerful, and so wealthy that it could mass produce everything, from antibiotics to bombs to cotton underwear for its prisoners. The shame she had felt in the processing tent returned, but it was colder now, sharper. It was not personal. It was a national shame. They had not been defeated by soldiers. They had been defeated by this, by factories. "Nurse, the bandages?" The doctor's voice cut through her paralysis. Chio turned, her face a neutral mask. She took the box of gauze. She felt the doctor's eyes on her, assessing her. He nodded, a curt approval of her quick, efficient movements as she bandaged the patient's arm. She felt a spark, deep and unexpected. It was a dangerous feeling. Pride. She was good at this, and in this clean, white, orderly room, her skill mattered more than her nationality. Chio had found a rhythm. It was a sterile, silent rhythm, dictated by the scraping of metal charts and the precise hiss of the sterilizer. She had become Dr. Evans' shadow, anticipating his needs, prepping syringes, and maintaining a ruthless standard of hygiene on the ward. He had, in turn, begun to treat her less like a prisoner and more like a colleague. He would grunt good when he saw her charts or suturies without even looking up, trusting she would have them ready. This fragile truce, built on shared professionalism, was shattered on a Tuesday. The infirmary door was thrust open, not pushed, allowing a gust of damp, muddy air to swirl inside. A new officer stood there, one Chio had not seen. He was younger than Evans, with a face hardened by irritation rather than exhaustion. He wore no medical insignia. His tag identified him as a captain in the quartermaster corps. He was holding a clipboard, and he was visibly angry. "Evans!" he snapped, ignoring Chio completely. "What the hell is this requisition?" Dr. Evans, who was lancing a boil on a prisoner's arm, did not look up. "It is exactly what it says it is, Captain. Penicillin, 10,000 units. Sulfadiazine, 500 tablets. Adabrine, as available." The quartermaster captain marched further into the hut, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. He slapped the clipboard. "This is a hospital ward. Evans, not a damn charity. Half these requisitions are for the Jap compound. I just saw the logs. You're burning through penicillin like it's water." Evans finished his work, placed a clean cotton bandage on the wound, and nodded to the Japanese patient. Out! Only when the man had shuffled away did Evans turn to the captain. He was wiping his hands on a clean white towel. "These are my patients, Captain Price." "They are not," Price retorted, his voice rising. "They are prisoners of war. They are the enemy. My job is to supply the United States Army. Every vial of penicillin you waste on them," he jabbed a finger toward the cots holding Tomiko and the others, "is a vial I don't have for a GI who might need it." Chio froze. She pretended to be busy with a bedpan, but her entire body was a knot of tension. This was the voice of the propaganda. This was the Kite devil she had been taught to expect. She had been naive. The order, the cleanliness, the clean underwear, it was all a facade. This Captain Price was the truth. "The war in the Pacific is over, Captain," Evans said, his voice dangerously low. "It's not over for the mothers of the boys who died on the Bataan Death March," Price shouted. "It's not over for me. You will amend this requisition, prioritize our men, give the prisoners aspirin. That is final." There was a long, terrible silence. Chio could hear the rain on the roof, the weak cough of Tomiko from the cot. Dr. Evans walked slowly to the sink. He washed his hands again, methodically. He dried them. Then he turned, his tired eyes suddenly as hard as steel. "They are patients," he said, "in my infirmary." He took a step toward Price, who instinctively recoiled. "As long as they are in my infirmary, they are under my care. My care is dictated by the Geneva Convention and by my oath, not by your inventory sheet." He grabbed the clipboard from Price's hand. "You will sign the requisition." "I will not." "You will," Evans interrupted, his voice a low growl. "Or the next man who comes in here with gonorrhea, I will tell him, 'Sorry, son, Captain Price thinks the Japanese prisoners are a higher priority than your shore leave.' How long do you think your career lasts after that?" It was a brutal, bureaucratic threat. Chio watched, mesmerized. Price's face turned purple. He snatched a pen from his pocket, scribbled an illegible signature on the form, and threw it onto the desk. "This isn't over, Evans." "It is for today," Evans said, picking up the sheet. "Now get out of my infirmary. You're bringing in the mud." The captain left, slamming the door. Evans stood for a moment, his shoulders slumped. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, his exhaustion complete. He looked at Chio, who was still frozen, holding the bedpan. He said nothing. He simply pointed at it. "Clean it. Sterilize it. Next patient." Chio's hands were shaking. She realized that the civilization she had witnessed was not a system. It was a man. It was a single, tired, angry doctor who was fighting his own army for the right to do his job. The clean sheets, the medicine, the very order of this place. It was not automatic. It was fragile. The confrontation between Evans and Price settled into a tense, unspoken status quo. The supplies kept coming, and Chio kept working. A full month passed. The rains lessened. Tomiko was weak but recovering, her fever broken by the steady, miraculous supply of quinine. Chio had even taught her how to fold the corners of the white sheets in the precise American military style. Chio herself had changed. She moved with a purpose that felt detached from her prisoner status. Her hands were no longer raw. The antiseptic soap had toughened them. She had gained a little weight from the regular, bland meals. She was, she realized with a start, healthier than she had been a year ago, on the front lines. This fragile peace was predicated on ignorance. The camp was a capsule, sealed off from the world. They knew the war was over, but they did not know how it had ended. One afternoon, the guards came through the tents with a new kind of energy. They were not delivering supplies or shouting orders. They were delivering mail. It was Red Cross mail, censored, delayed, and thin. For most prisoners, It was the first contact with home in over a year. A nervous silence fell over the camp, more profound than the rain. Chio was given 3 letters, all addressed to her old military hospital unit. Her hands trembled as she opened the first one, from her aunt in Hiroshima. It was dated 3 months prior. The letter was short, the handwriting shaky and blurred by what might have been tears or water damage. It had been heavily censored. Black ink covered half the sentences, but what remained was enough. All gone. The flash. Kiko and your cousins. The river. Burned shadows. Do not come home. There is no home. A city of ghosts. Chio's vision narrowed. The sounds of the infirmary, a man coughing, the clink of glass, faded into a distant roar. The white walls of the hut seemed to press in on her. A city of ghosts. She dropped the letter. She looked at her own hands. They were clean. They were whole. She had just used hot water and yellow soap. A sudden, violent wave of nausea rose in her throat. She felt the gaze of the patients on her, the quiet curiosity. She turned and walked out of the infirmary, not fast, but with a terrible, rigid purpose. She walked past the guard, who was reading his own mail, and paid her no mind. She did not stop until she reached Tent 7. It was empty, the other women assigned to afternoon work details. She stumbled to her cot, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had not cried. This was something beyond tears. It was a hollowing out. She ripped back her thin pillow. There, folded neatly, was the clean white cotton underwear she had received on that first day. She had kept it hidden, a secret talisman of her shame, her survival, her transformation. Now she clawed it out. She held the soft, machine-made fabric to her face. It smelled faintly of her soap, clean, orderly, civilized. She thought of the burned shadows her aunt described. She sank to the floor, clutching the small piece of cloth, and a sound was ripped from her chest, a low animal wail of grief and guilt. Why her? Why was she alive and clean and safe, tended to by the very men who had dropped the fire? Why was she, the enemy, given the dignity of clean underwear and hot meals, while her family, her city, had been erased? The propaganda had been wrong about American brutality, but it had not prepared her for this deeper, more agonizing irony. She did not know how long she sat there, rocking in the dirt-floored tent, pressing the fabric to her face. The tent flap opened. It was Dr. Evans. He must have followed her. He stood in the entrance, his face shadowed, blocking the light. He looked at her, at the letters scattered on the cot, at the small piece of white fabric clutched in her fist. He understood everything. He did not speak. He did not offer condolences or justifications. He simply reached into his pocket, took something out, and placed it on her empty cot. Then he turned and left her alone. Chio stared at the object. It was a Hershey's chocolate bar. February 10, 1946. The date, which meant nothing to Chio, had thrown the camp into a state of meticulously managed panic. For a week, they had been scrubbing. Tents were aired, latrines limed, and supply lists were posted and reposted. It was a performance of order, and Chio, from her position in the infirmary, understood it perfectly. The Americans were not cleaning for the prisoners. They were cleaning for the inspectors. Rumors had solidified into fact. The International Red Cross was coming. The tension was different from the early days of fear. It was a tension of anticipation. And at its center was Captain Mizoguchi. He had been designated, by virtue of his rank, as the official prisoner representative. The night before, Tomiko had been trembling. "Mizoguchi-sama," she whispered in their tent. "He will tell them we are defiant. He will tell them about you. He will tell them the truth," Chio had said, though she was not sure what that truth was anymore. The chocolate bar from Dr. Evans, long since eaten, had left a complicated aftertaste, an acknowledgement of her grief that transcended language or sides. Now, the inspectors were here. Chio had returned to Tent 7 to check on Tomoko, who was still listed as convalescing. The damp chill of the pre-dawn air clung to the wool blanket. Chio held it tighter, tucking it around Tomoko, who huddled beside her. The tent flap snapped open, letting in the smell of antiseptic soap. Chio registered the smell instantly. 10 weeks ago, it was the smell of processing, of fear. Today, it was the smell of her work. It was the smell of the infirmary, of Dr. Evans's obsessive cleanliness. A sharp, clipped voice from an American officer. "Attention, Red Cross inspection." A woman in a neutral-colored uniform entered, clipboard poised. Chio recognized her type instantly. An administrator, efficient and detached. She was followed by the unhappy-looking Nisei interpreter and a guard. The woman ignored them. She tapped the stacked crates near the entrance, crates that had been delivered just the day before. Inventory: soap, 10 units. Sanitary, 5 units. Hosiery, 5 units. Chio's eyes flickered to the list tacked to the tent pole, a schedule of hygiene, meals, and processing. 10 weeks ago, it had been a list of inscrutable, threatening rules. Now she could read half the words in English. She knew it was a ritual of order, not of malice. She thought of Captain Price and his requisition forms, of the fight over penicillin. This was the same. This was logistics. Tomiko flinched as the inspector's gaze passed over her, her breath catching in a small, fearful sound. Chio's reaction was automatic. February 10th, 1946, repatriation camp, Manila. The damp chill of the pre-dawn air clung to the wool blanket.
It's all right.
Chio held it tighter, not for herself, but for Tomiko, the younger nurse, huddled beside her.
Just an inspection.
The tent flap snapped open,
She was speaking
letting in the
not
smell
just
of
to
antiseptic
Tomiko,
soap and the
but to the
sharp,
ghost of
clipped
herself
voice
from 10
of an
weeks
American
prior.
officer.
The terrified
Attention,
woman who had stood in
Red
this
Cross
very
inspection.
mud, clutching a piece
A
of
woman in a
clean
neutral
underwear
uniform
as
entered,
if it
her
were a
clipboard
bomb.
poised. She ignored
That
them,
woman had
instead
expected
tapping the
devils.
stacked crates.
Chio, the
Inventory:
nurse, now
soap,
understood.
10 units.
The true power
Sanitary,
had not been
5
the
units.
threat of violence.
Hosiery, 5
The
units.
true power
Chio's
was the
eyes
absence
fixed
of
on the
it,
list tacked to the tent
replaced by
pole,
this
a
overwhelming,
schedule of hygiene,
impersonal,
meals,
relentless
and
system.
processing.
A
It was a
system that
ritual
fought over
of
penicillin
order,
requisitions
not of
and
malice.
provided hosiery for
Tomiko
inspectors.
flinched as the
A
inspector's
system
gaze
that could
passed
drop
over her.
fire on a city
Chio
and
placed a
chocolate
steadying
on a
hand
cob.
on her arm.
The
"It's all
inspector
right,"
made a final note
she whispered,
and moved
the words
on.
stiff in her own throat.
Tent 7.
"Just an
compliant,"
inspection."
she said to the officer.
If these quiet moments,
As the group exited,
lost between the
Chio
headlines
saw
of war,
Captain Mizuguchi
resonate with
standing
you,
outside,
consider
observing the
subscribing
entire
and letting us
exchange.
know what country you
He
are
was with
watching
Dr.
from.
Evans,
The
and they were both
processing
speaking
tent
to the
smelled
head
of lye,
inspector.
steam, and a
When the
sharp
delegation moved on
antiseptic
to the
that
next
reminded
tent,
Chio of
Mizuguchi
hospitals.
paused.
But
His
this was
gaze
not a
met
place of
Chio's.
healing.
There was no
It was a
contempt.
place of
There was
disassembly.
no anger.
Next
It was a
line,
long,
move,
silent
move!
look of acknowledgement.
The commands were in
He had
English,
seen her,
sharp
not
barks that
cowering,
herded them
but
like
managing.
animals.
He had seen
Chio
her
kept her
speak their
eyes down,
language,
her body
calm
trembling under
another
the
prisoner.
thin, torn
He
remnants
had
of her
seen
uniform.
Her become a part
This
of
was
the
it.
new world he could
The
not
moment
understand.
propaganda had warned her
He
of.
gave a very
The
slight,
Kaiti,
almost
the American devils,
imperceptible nod.
would now begin their
Then he
sport.
turned and
She had
walked
braced
toward the
herself
men's
for
quarters.
brutality, for violation,
word was on
for the
everyone's
ultimate
lips.
humiliation
A word
that
that had
soldiers
only been a
inflicted
rumor
upon the women
until the
of a
inspectors
defeated
arrived.
nation.
Repatriation.
She had spent 2 days
The Red
in the
Cross
transport truck,
inspection was a tipping
rehearsing
point.
the ways she might
Camp's
die,
machinery,
praying
which
only
had
for
been
the
focused
strength
on
to not
containment,
disgrace her
now
family when the
shifted
moment
to
came.
disposal. Repatriation.
Strip! Now!
The word echoed
All
through
of
the
it.
tents,
A
bringing
broad-shouldered
not joy,
American woman,
but a
a
profound,
WWII
terrified
Women's
silence.
Army Corps with
To be
sergeant's
sent home
stripes
meant
and a
confronting the
face
city
devoid of
ghosts her
all
aunt had
emotion
described.
pointed at their
The
clothes.
final days were a
This was the
blur
first
of
shock.
administrative
The
processing,
guards were
a
women.
mirror image of
They
their
were not
arrival.
leering,
They
drunken
were
men.
marched to
They were
delousing
cold,
stations again,
efficient,
given medical
and seemed
examinations,
utterly
this
disgusted by
time
the state of
Dr.
the
Evans,
prisoners.
who simply stamped
Chio and the
Chio's
others,
form with
nurses,
fit for travel
civilian staff,
without meeting
a
her
few
eyes,
local
and
collaborators
lined up to
fumbled
return
with their
their
buttons.
American-issued gear.
The air was cold,
They stood
but
in
the
a
shame
long,
was
quiet
colder.
line,
They were herded naked under harsh, steaming showers. Rough lye soap was thrust into their hands. It stung their skin, raw from insects and filth, but Chio scrubbed with a mechanical fury. She would not give them a reason. Then they were pushed into the next tent. It was colder here, and they huddled together for warmth, their dignity stripped away, waiting. Chio's fear was a cold stone in her stomach. The same stern-faced sergeant stood by a stack of wooden crates. Line, single file. One by one, the women shuffled forward. The sergeant, working with the impersonal rhythm of a factory machine, thrust a bundle at each woman, a small bar of soap, a thin towel. Then it was Chio's turn. The items were pressed into her numb hands. She looked down, and she stopped. There, on top of the towel, was a pair of white folded cotton underwear. Her mind ceased to function. She stared. The sergeant frowned. "Move it, sister." Chio stumbled aside, her eyes locked on the object. It was not a rough-spun rag. It was not military issue. It was soft. It was white. It was pristine. The factory crease still sharp down the middle. "Curé," she whispered, the word catching in her throat. Clean. She had not seen or felt anything truly clean in months. For the last 6 weeks of the war, she had used a strip of blood-stained parachute silk. She looked from the clean underwear in her hand to the filthy rag she had managed to hide in her fist. A wave of heat rushed to her face, so powerful it made her dizzy. It was not fear. It was shame. A profound, acidic shame that burned deeper than any physical blow could have. She had prepared for devils. She had not prepared for this. She had not prepared for a civilization so powerful, so wealthy, that it could afford to give this symbol of personal, private dignity to its most hated enemies. Chio clutched the clean underwear. It was the most shocking weapon the Americans had yet deployed. She quickly pulled them on beneath the shadow of the tent wall, the soft, clean cotton, an alien sensation against her skin. It felt less like a gift and more like a verdict. The processing tent led to a long, muddy pathway flanked by rows of identical canvas tents. A guard, no older than her kid brother, pointed. Tent 7, female, in. Chio entered, her gaze sweeping the interior. It was a standard American general-purpose tent, a long canvas tunnel supported by wooden poles. 20 cots, 10 to a side, were arranged with military precision. A single, bare bulb. February 10th, 1946, repatriation camp, Manila. The damp chill of the pre-dawn air clung to the wool blanket. Chio held it tighter, not for herself, but for Tomiko, the younger nurse, huddled beside her. The tent flap snapped open, letting in the smell of antiseptic soap and the sharp, clipped voice of an American officer.